My name is Daniel Reed. I'm 41 years old, born and raised in Colorado. And if you'd met me 10 years ago, you wouldn't have believed where I'd end up. Honestly, back then, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. Just last month, I walked out of a closing office holding a folder that represented the biggest moment of my life. A signed deal for the sale of my property. $18,700,000. $18.7 million. The room had smelled of fresh coffee and printer ink, the sound of papers sliding across a polished table. The buyers shook my hand, lawyers stamped the last signatures, and my bank account transformed in real time. The deal was done. It was final. Years of work, sacrifice, and sleepless nights condensed into a single number that still feels unreal when I say it out loud. But as I stood there, heart pounding, trying to process what I had just achieved, one voice kept echoing in my head. Not the buyers, not my lawyers, not even my own. It was my oldest friend, the man I'd once trusted like a brother. You'll never succeed, Daniel. You don't have what it takes. I can still remember the way he said it, the smirk on his face, the dismissive shake of his head. At the time, those words cut me deeper than I wanted to admit. I laughed it off in front of him, but when I went home that night, I stared at the ceiling for hours, wondering if maybe he was right. Because back then, I didn't look like someone destined for millions. I was exhausted, broke half the time, pouring every cent into projects that seemed doomed to fail. While he partied, traveled, and sneered at my pipe dreams, I was out there chasing properties no one else believed in, and all the while, his words haunted me. But here's the thing about betrayal, about doubt, about being underestimated. It can crush you, or it can fuel you. That night, lying awake, I made a decision. If he wanted to count me out, fine. I'd let him. But I'd never count myself out. Years later, as I held that folder with $18.7 million worth of signatures inside, I didn't call him. I didn't rub it in his face. I didn't even need to. Because success speaks for itself. And the irony, the very property he said would never sell became the deal that proved him wrong forever. I walked out of that closing office with my head high, the Colorado sun hitting my face, and a quiet smile. Not just because of the money, but because of the justice. He said I'd never succeed, but I just closed at $18.7 million. And that was only the beginning. Before that closing day, before the $18 million, before the silence of victory, my life looked very different. I didn't come from wealth, and nothing was handed to me. I built my path one stubborn, exhausting step at a time. I grew up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Denver. My parents were hardworking people. Dad drove trucks. Mom worked part-time at a grocery store. We weren't poor, but we were always just one paycheck away from stress. Vacations were road trips in second-hand cars. Dinners were often simple casseroles, and school clothes were bought on clearance. But my parents taught me something more valuable than money: perseverance. You don't quit just because it's hard, my father used to say. Hard is the whole point. That stuck with me. In high school, I wasn't the star athlete or the straight A student. I was just steady. I worked summers doing construction cleanup, saved every dollar, and dreamed of owning something real. Not just a paycheck, but property. My dream sounded ridiculous to most people around me, especially when I said it out loud. I wanted land, something I could shape, improve, and maybe one day sell for more than anyone thought possible. That dream followed me into adulthood, And along the way, so did my closest friend, Mark. Mark and I met in middle school. We were inseparable back then, sharing comic books, basketball games, and the kind of teenage plans you make under starlight when you think anything is possible. He was the guy I trusted, the one I thought would always be in my corner. When we grew older, we stayed close. Nights at bars, Sunday football games, even family cookouts. Mark was always there. But here's the thing about friendship. Time reveals whether it's built on loyalty or envy. At first, he seemed supportive when I started dabbling in real estate. My first purchase wasn't glamorous, a rundown duplex with leaky pipes and peeling paint. I lived in one half and rented the other. Every paycheck went into repairs. Most of my friends thought I was crazy. Mark laughed and called it Daniel's money pit, but I brushed it off. Friends tease, right? Still, the comments didn't stop. Every time I talked about my plans, Mark had something dismissive to say. When I scraped together enough to buy a small plot of land outside the city, he shook his head. Waste of money, man. Nobody's buying dirt. When I skipped vacations to pay property taxes, he joked that I was the poorest rich guy he knew. I thought he was just being blunt, honest, the kind of friend who doesn't sugarcoat things. But deep down, those words stung. Because while he laughed at my sacrifices, I was out there sweating through 16-hour days. I worked full-time in construction project management and spent my nights poring over zoning laws, building codes, and bank statements. I wasn't living large. I was eating ramen at a kitchen table covered in receipts. I drove a 10-year-old truck that coughed smoke every winter morning. Still, I kept going. Because I believed in the vision, even when no one else did. And for a long time, I believed Mark was still my friend. We celebrated holidays together, swapped birthday gifts, even helped each other move more times than I can count. When I doubted myself, he'd sometimes say, "Don't worry, you'll land on your feet." But then came the other comments, sharper, more biting. "You're wasting your best years on nothing. You're never going to make it big." The turning point came when I started talking seriously about a larger piece of property I wanted to develop. A stretch of land I believed had potential. It was risky. It would take loans, time, and more sweat than I'd ever given before. I remember sitting across from him at a bar, explaining my vision. His response wasn't laughter this time. It was cold. "Daniel, you'll never succeed. You don't have what it takes. Cut your losses before you embarrass yourself." I sat there, beer in hand, staring at the man I thought was my biggest supporter. His words echoed louder than the TVs blaring above us. Never succeed. Don't have what it takes. It felt like a punch to the gut. That night, I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I wanted to believe he was wrong, that he didn't mean it. But part of me wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I was just chasing a dream that would collapse around me. Still, I couldn't let it go. Because the life I thought I had, the stability, the loyalty of a friend, the belief that hard work spoke for itself, wasn't as solid as I once believed. I thought I had a best friend who'd cheer for me no matter what. What I really had was someone waiting to see me fail. And as I kept building, struggling, and clawing my way forward, his words didn't fade. They fueled me. But at the time, all I could see was the life I thought I had. A friendship that seemed unbreakable, a dream that seemed impossible, and a future I wasn't sure I could reach. Suspicion doesn't strike like lightning. It creeps, slow and quiet, until one day you realize you're standing in the middle of a storm. After Mark told me I'd never succeed, I tried to shake it off. I told myself he was just being blunt, that maybe he was looking out for me in his own twisted way. But once the words were out there, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. I started noticing things I'd brushed aside for years. Whenever I talked about new opportunities, he rolled his eyes. If I mentioned a potential investor, he'd mutter something about people wasting their money. When I described the long nights of work, he didn't nod with respect. He smirked like he was waiting for the punchline to a joke. It wasn't just skepticism, it was enjoyment. He seemed to take pleasure in predicting my failure. At first, I responded the way I always had, with nervous laughter, with a shrug, with excuses. But inside, I felt a slow burn. Not just anger, doubt. Every sneer, every sarcastic remark chipped away at my confidence. Still, I kept my mouth shut, because silence can be a weapon. As the years went by, my projects grew more serious. I was juggling loans, property taxes, zoning meetings, and sleepless nights. I didn't have time to argue with someone who wasn't in the trenches with me, but I started watching Mark more closely, and that's when I realized his discouragement wasn't passive. It was active. One afternoon, an acquaintance pulled me aside at a networking event. He asked, "Hey, what's going on with that land deal of yours?" Mark said, "It's a lost cause." My stomach dropped. Mark wasn't just doubting me to my face. He was spreading it behind my back. To colleagues, to investors, to anyone who might have been in a position to help me. I smiled at the man, brushed it off, and said, "Don't believe everything you hear." But inside, my hands shook with anger. That night, I went back over every conversation I'd ever had with Mark. Every time he told me I was wasting my time. Every time he said no one would ever want the properties I was buying. And I realized it wasn't friendly banter. It wasn't tough love. It was sabotage dressed as honesty. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I just stopped telling him things. And that silence was the beginning of my strategy. While Mark thought I was slowing down, giving up, or failing in silence, I was grinding harder than ever. I stopped seeking his approval, stopped waiting for his validation, and poured everything into the work. The tension grew. He'd ask about my projects, fishing for details. I'd shrug and say, "Nothing much going on." He'd laugh, satisfied, as if my silence confirmed his predictions. But behind closed doors, I was meeting with developers, negotiating with banks, and slowly shaping the deal of a lifetime. Meanwhile, I kept hearing whispers. Friends mentioned that Mark had been warning people not to get involved with me. He'd say I was reckless, that I didn't know what I was doing, that I'd drag others down with me. Each whisper stung, but I stayed quiet. Because the more he tried to undermine me, the clearer the truth became. He didn't want me to succeed. He wanted me to fail. And that realization was both painful and freeing. Painful because I had to admit my so-called friend wasn't a friend at all. Freeing because once I knew his true motives, I no longer cared about his opinion. The unraveling wasn't just in him, it was in me too. I started to see the cracks in our friendship that had been there all along. The jealousy when I bought my first property. The smirk when I skipped vacations to pay off loans. The way he bragged about his short-term wins while mocking my long-term grind. For years, I had ignored it, convincing myself it was normal. But now, with his words still echoing, "You'll never succeed," I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tension reached its peak when I learned he had gone a step further. An investor I'd been in quiet talks with pulled out of negotiations. When I asked why, he hesitated before finally admitting, "Mark told me you're in over your head." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded, thanked him for his honesty, and walked away. Because that was the moment I knew. Mark wasn't just doubting me. He was actively sabotaging me. And he was doing it with a smile, pretending it was for my own good. I went home that night, sat in my truck outside the property I was pouring my life into, and stared at the empty land. Weeds, dirt, broken fences. Most people saw nothing. But I saw potential, and in that moment, my suspicion solidified into certainty. This wasn't just about proving myself right. It was about proving him wrong. Not with words, not with arguments, but with results so undeniable they would silence him forever. I gripped the steering wheel and whispered to myself, "He thinks I'll never succeed. Fine, I'll let him believe it. And when the time comes, he'll choke on the truth." From then on, the silence between us grew. He thought my lack of updates meant I was failing. In reality, it meant I was preparing. And every late night, every setback, every sacrifice became fuel. Fuel to prove that his doubt wasn't my destiny, because I knew the day would come when silence would break. And when it did, it wouldn't be with words. It would be with an $18.7 million deal stamped in ink. Up until then, I'd carried a thin thread of doubt. Maybe Mark was just blunt. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe deep down, he still wanted the best for me, even if his words came out sharp. That thread snapped the day I learned what he had really done. It was a Friday evening when I met with a local developer I'd been courting for months. We sat across from each other in a quiet steakhouse, contracts spread across the table, the smell of grilled meat thick in the air. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and said, "Daniel, I'll be honest. I almost didn't come tonight. Mark told me you're a lost cause. Said you're drowning in debt and don't know what you're doing." The words hit me harder than a punch. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "He said that?" I asked, my voice calm but low. The developer nodded. "Not once. Repeatedly, he practically begged me not to work with you. But I've looked at your numbers, Daniel. I know potential when I see it. That's why I'm here." I forced a smile, but inside, something broke. It wasn't doubt anymore. It wasn't insecurity. It was betrayal. Naked, undeniable betrayal. Mark hadn't just mocked me behind closed doors. He had tried to sabotage me publicly, poisoning opportunities before they even had a chance to grow. I drove home that night in silence, headlights cutting through the dark Colorado roads. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but my mind was somewhere else, replaying every memory of Mark, every joke at my expense, every sneer I'd brushed off as just how he is. And for the first time, I saw them for what they really were. Daggers. That was the moment I knew. Mark wasn't a friend. He never had been, not really. He was an anchor disguised as company, a weight pulling me down every time I tried to rise. And I had let him, but no more. That night, I made a decision. I didn't text him. I didn't call. I didn't confront him with angry words or demand explanations. Confrontation would have given him power, fed his satisfaction. Instead, I went quiet. Completely, utterly quiet. I locked my plans behind my teeth and poured my energy into the property. I doubled down on research, strengthened my financing, cut unnecessary expenses, and surrounded myself only with people who believed in the vision. Mark wanted me to fail, and the best way to answer him was to succeed in silence. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words echoed, "You'll never succeed." But instead of cutting me down, they lit a fire. Each syllable became fuel. I whispered into the dark, "Watch me." From that night forward, I didn't see myself as someone struggling to prove a dream. I saw myself as someone preparing for inevitability. Success wasn't a question anymore. It was a matter of time. The snap wasn't loud. It wasn't a fight or a dramatic goodbye. It was quiet, internal, unshakable. I stopped asking for permission. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped hoping he'd change. Because the truth was clear. Mark wanted me to fail. And I was going to prove him wrong in the only language he'd understand. Results. Not someday, not maybe, but with a property sale that would silence every doubt he'd ever spoken. The night I realized Mark wasn't just doubting me, but actively trying to sabotage me, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a burst of rage. It wasn't a vow of dramatic revenge. It was colder, sharper, steadier than that. I decided to go silent. No more explaining myself. No more sharing half-finished ideas, hoping for encouragement that would never come. No more giving him access to dreams he only wanted to trample. If Mark wanted to believe I was failing, I would let him. His laughter would only echo in the dark while I quietly built something so undeniable he couldn't touch it. And that's exactly what I did. The first step was financial discipline. I looked at my accounts with brutal honesty. I sold off things I didn't need, cut every unnecessary expense, and funneled every spare dollar into the property. My truck was old and rattled like a tin can, but it still ran. My wardrobe was basic. My vacations were non-existent. While others flashed their weekend getaways online, I was eating takeout on the hood of my truck after zoning meetings. Every dollar I saved became a brick in the foundation of my success. The second step was education. I spent nights at the library combing through zoning laws, permit requirements, tax codes. I attended city council meetings, sometimes the only guy under 50 in the room, just to listen, take notes, and understand the process better than anyone else. Knowledge became my weapon. I didn't want to depend on anyone else to tell me what I could or couldn't do with that land. The third step was building allies. I stopped wasting energy on people like Mark and started surrounding myself with believers. A retired developer who had made millions in Denver real estate. A local banker who appreciated my work ethic enough to give me his personal number. A lawyer who didn't care that I wasn't a big client yet. She respected that I came prepared, with every document labeled and organized. They became my silent team. They didn't just hand me shortcuts. They sharpened me. The banker taught me how to structure financing so I wouldn't drown in interest. The developer shared hard-won lessons about timing the market. The lawyer taught me to anticipate loopholes and close them before anyone else could exploit them. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. Mark would text sometimes asking how my money pit was doing. I'd shrug it off with vague replies. Same as always. He'd laugh, assuming I was stuck. He'd tell others, Daniel's still chasing his dead land project. And the more he underestimated me, the more focused I became. Because silence wasn't failure. Silence was preparation. The fourth step was persistence. Deals didn't come easily. Banks turned me down. Developers walked away. Buyers scoffed. Every rejection cut deep. But instead of breaking me, it sharpened me. I studied why they said no, adjusted, and came back stronger. If a bank thought my numbers were weak, I rebuilt the spreadsheets. If a developer worried about infrastructure, I met with city engineers until I had answers. If someone doubted the land's potential, I researched comparable properties until I could prove the upside. Every no became fuel for a better yes. And while all this was happening, I never once complained to Mark. He thought my silence meant I'd given up. In reality, my silence was the sound of bricks stacking higher and higher. The fifth step was timing. Real estate is as much about patience as it is about vision. The property I held onto sat undervalued for years. People mocked me for paying taxes on a worthless patch of dirt, but I saw what they didn't. Development creeping closer year by year, new businesses opening within miles, traffic patterns shifting, zoning laws slowly favoring expansion. I waited, I worked, I endured. And when the timing aligned, when demand finally caught up with vision, I was ready. I had everything in place: clean titles, updated surveys, environmental reports, and permits ready to go. While others scrambled to catch up, I already had a binder thick with preparation. Buyers didn't have to guess. I handed them proof. The final step was emotional control. That might sound strange, but it was crucial. There were nights when the stress almost broke me. Times when deals looked like they'd collapse. Times when I stared at bank balances and wondered if I was crazy. And every time I'd hear Mark's voice, "You'll never succeed." It hurt. But instead of breaking me, it became the spark that pushed me through. I didn't need to prove him wrong in arguments. I needed to prove him wrong in reality. So I stayed calm, focused, steady. Even when it felt like I was drowning, I refused to show weakness. Not to him, not to anyone. Years of this routine, saving, studying, networking, waiting, enduring, built the path that led me to the closing table. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with shortcuts. It happened with silence, with every quiet choice to prepare instead of brag, with every late night spent learning instead of drinking, with every no I turned into a yes. Mark thought I disappeared. He thought I'd failed. He thought his words had buried me. What he didn't realize was that I was underground for a reason, not buried, planted. And when the day came, what grew out of that soil would be undeniable. Because while he was laughing at my silence, I was preparing an $18.7 million storm. And when it hit, he wouldn't be able to laugh anymore. The day of the closing wasn't dramatic on the surface. No fireworks, no headlines, no crowd gathered to cheer. Just a quiet office, a long table, a stack of documents, and the steady scratch of pens on paper. But for me, it was the most powerful moment of my life. I arrived early, binder under my arm, suit pressed, nerves calm. I had rehearsed this day 100 times in my head, what it would look like, how it would feel. Still, when the lawyers slid the first document across the table, I paused. My hands hovered over the pen. $18,700,000. That was the number printed in black and white. I signed, one page after another. Buyers nodded, lawyers confirmed, and the deal slowly transformed from possibility into reality. By the time I set the pen down, it was done. Years of sacrifice, silence, and preparation condensed into a single moment of truth. The property I had fought for, the land everyone mocked, the dream Mark swore would never amount to anything, had just sold for $18.7 million. And I didn't need to say a word. The news spread faster than I expected. In real estate circles, deals of that size don't stay quiet. Within days, colleagues, bankers, and developers were reaching out. Congratulations, handshakes, emails piling up. And eventually, Word reached Mark. I know because he called me. I was sitting on my porch, Colorado sun dipping low, glass of bourbon in my hand, when his name lit up my phone. For a moment, I just stared at it. The same name that once meant loyalty, but now felt like poison. I thought about ignoring it, but curiosity won. I answered. There was a pause on the line, then his voice, quieter than I remembered. Daniel, I heard about the sale. Silence stretched between us. I didn't rush to fill it. Finally, he said, 18 million? That's unbelievable. I guess you proved me wrong, almost laughed. Proved you wrong? Those words barely scratched the surface of what I had done, but I didn't gloat. I didn't remind him of every time he mocked me, every time he tried to sabotage me. I didn't throw his words back in his face. You'll never succeed. I just said, calmly, yeah. It went through another long pause. Then he muttered something about being happy for me, about wanting to catch up soon. I didn't commit to anything. I ended the call politely, but firmly. Because revenge isn't about screaming in someone's face. Revenge is about living in a way that makes their doubt irrelevant. And in that moment, Mark was irrelevant. The deeper satisfaction came later, when I attended a networking event downtown. The room buzzed with talk of deals, markets, opportunities. When I walked in, heads turned. People knew my name now. Not because of rumors, not because of Mark's poison, but because of results. I shook hands with bankers who once brushed me off. I sat across from developers who had once doubted my vision, and every single one of them looked at me differently now. Respect replaced skepticism. Opportunity replaced dismissal. Meanwhile, Mark lingered in the same circles, but his words no longer carried weight. The whispers that once warned people away from me had flipped. Now, they warned people about him. He underestimated Daniel, nearly ruined a partnership. Don't take him seriously. He didn't need me to confront him. Life had done it for me. The fall wasn't his silence. It was mine. Because through it all, I never argued. I never defended myself against his insults. I never begged him to believe in me. I let him believe the worst. I let him laugh. Let him sneer. Let him spread rumors. And while he wasted his breath, I built my future. Now the proof was stamped, signed, wired into my account. $18.7 million. That was the sound of revenge. Not shouting, not gloating, not rubbing his face in it. Just cold, undeniable success. In the weeks after, I thought about sending him a message, a single photo of the closing documents, maybe a screenshot of my bank account, something to hammer the point home. But every time the idea crossed my mind, I let it go. Because true revenge isn't about showing them. It's about not needing to. Mark had said I'd never succeed. And yet, here I was, walking through doors he'd never even touch, shaking hands with people who wouldn't return his calls. That was enough. The fall wasn't mine. It was his. Because by underestimating me, he had revealed himself. He showed the world his envy, his bitterness, his inability to celebrate someone else's success. And when the tide turned, he was left exposed, a man whose words carried no weight, whose predictions meant nothing, whose friendship dissolved in the shadow of undeniable truth. As for me, I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his approval. I had something far greater, proof that persistence, patience, and silence can build a future louder than any insult. The fall had already happened. He just hadn't realized it until he heard the number, 18,700,000. and by then, it was too late. When the ink dried on that contract, when the wires cleared and the property was no longer mine, something unexpected happened. Yes, there was relief. Yes, there was pride. But more than anything, there was peace. For years, I had carried Mark's words like a stone in my chest. You'll never succeed. They echoed when banks turned me down, when buyers walked away, when I sat in the dark wondering if the sacrifices were worth it. They burned when I ate cheap meals while friends flaunted vacations. They haunted me in every sleepless night of doubt. But the day the deal closed, the echo stopped. Because the number, $18.7 million, silenced it forever. In the weeks that followed, I didn't flaunt it. I didn't post pictures of checks or cars or champagne bottles. That's never been my style. Instead, I focused on building a new kind of life. I paid off debts, set up trust accounts for my daughter, and invested wisely. I met with financial planners who spoke to me not as a risk, but as a partner. For once, I didn't feel like I was begging for a seat at the table. I was at the head of it. Mark drifted further into the background. The friendship that had already been fractured became nothing more than a memory. He never apologized, not sincerely, at least, but I realized I didn't need him to. His doubt had already served its purpose. It had fueled me when I needed it most. It had turned my anger into determination, my silence into strategy. In a way, he gave me the greatest gift, the push to prove him wrong. Still, I grieved the loss of what I thought we had. Betrayal always leaves a scar. But scars aren't just reminders of pain. They're proof you survived it. I also learned something important. Success isn't about the dollar figure. Don't get me wrong, $18.7 million changes a life. But the true victory was deeper. It was about taking every sneer, every rumor, every whispered he's going to fail, and turning it into fuel for something undeniable. It was about proving that loyalty to your dream matters more than loyalty to people who don't believe in you. It was about realizing that sometimes silence is stronger than shouting. Mark thought my quiet meant defeat. In reality, my quiet was the sound of success being built. Life looks different now. I still work, still chase opportunities, but I do it with balance. I take vacations with my daughter. I wake up without a knot of stress in my stomach. I sit on my porch in the Colorado sun and actually breathe. And when I think about Mark now, it's not with anger. It's with clarity. He said I'd never succeed. He was wrong. But more than that, he showed me a truth I'll never forget. Not everyone who calls themselves your friend is rooting for you. Some are just waiting for you to fall. The lesson: choose carefully who you let into your circle, protect your dreams, and never hand the pen of your story to someone who wants to write your failure. Because the best revenge isn't telling them they were wrong. It's living in a way that makes it impossible for them to ever be right. He said I'd never succeed. I didn't just succeed, I soared. And I did it without him. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and share it with someone who's ever been doubted. Subscribe for more real stories of justice, resilience, and triumph. Every week, I bring you journeys where betrayal turns into strength and doubt is crushed by determination. Stay strong, stay focused, and I'll see you in the next story.